The inverse cosine function is handled similarly. The restricted cosine function f of x is equal to the cosine of x, where x is in between 0 and pi inclusive, is 1 to 1, okay, as you can see here in this figure. And so it has an inverse function denoted by cosine inverse or arc cosine. So cosine inverse of x is equal to y implies that the cosine of y is equal to x, and that y, the angle for cosine, is in between 0 and pi, inclusively. Now the inverse cosine function, cosine inverse, has a domain from -1 to 1. So you can see here it goes from -1 to 1, and the range goes from 0 to pi. And it is a continuous function whose graph is shown here. Okay, now its derivative is given by the following. So let's go ahead and prove that. So the first thing is we're going to let y equal the cosine inverse of x. Okay, and then we would say that the cosine of y is equal to x, and that y is going to be in between 0 and pi inclusively. Okay, so if we want to take the derivative, step 3, we have the cosine of y, which is equal to x. We're going to take the derivative with implicitly, so the derivative, the cosine of y on the left-hand side, we have negative sine of y times dy over dx, and the derivative of x is going to equal 1. Okay, now if we want to solve for dy over dx, then it's going to equal -1 over the sine of y. Okay, now remember that sine squared y plus cosine squared y is equal to 1. So if we want to solve for sine of y, then the sine squared y is going to equal 1 minus the cosine squared y. If we take the square root of both sides, then the sine of y is going to equal 1 minus the cosine squared y. So what that tells us is that dy over dx is now going to equal -1 over the sine of y, which becomes the square root of 1 minus the cosine squared y. Okay, and then we're going to replace the cosine squared y to be x from our step number 2. So recall that this is dy over dx, which is equal to the -1 over the square root of 1 minus the cosine of y squared, which is equal to -1 over the square root of 1 minus x squared. Okay, and let's make note here that the sine of y is greater than or equal to 0 for all values of y that are in between 0 and pi. So that gives us definition number 2. So the definition of number 2 tells us that the derivative with respect to x, or the cosine inverse of x, is equal to -1 over the square root of 1 minus x squared, where x is going to be in between -1 and 1.